My name is Ryan Snyder. I have a transportation planning consulting practice in Los Angeles. Over the years have done primarily bicycle and pedestrian work, although some transit work and some ride share and so forth. But I've followed the career of some of my colleagues, Dan Burden and Michael Ronkin and Peter Lagerwey and some others I think that many of you are familiar with. And many of us have sort of gone along a similar path in our work, and that, back in the late 70s and 80s, it was a matter of trying to find space in the street for a bike lane. And then, come the 90s and maybe some bike paths, and then come the 90s, we're thinking about pedestrians. And we're looking at sidewalks, and we're looking at intersection crossings and things like that. And then as we're trying to do these things, and as we're trying to find space for bike lanes, oh gee, the curb-to-curb width already exists, you can't fit bike lanes in, and the standard says, we really can't put them in anyhow. And some of the things you want to do for pedestrians maybe run up against some sort of manual or standards or guidelines that are out there and whatnot. And a number of us have come to the same conclusion at the same time. Okay, it's time to change the bleeping standards and manuals. And so as we've seen, and at the same time, becoming more aware of, if we're thinking about a walkable community, it's more than just sidewalks and intersections. It's new urbanism, it's landform, it's all these other things. And as we start to get into our work, well, when you brought in, for example, to create a nice pedestrian crossing for a street, this happened to me several years ago. City and National City said we need a good pedestrian crossing here along these actually several different arterial streets. Can you create some? We've got schools, we've got businesses on both sides. And you look at the street and you say, 18,000 cars a day, 4 lanes, high speed. Do you really need 4 lanes here? And so you start to look at, well, what if we do a road diet? What if we put bike lanes in and bring it down to, the 3 lanes, and and then we can beautify the street with some islands and some other things. And in the meantime, we got a really nice pedestrian crossing out of it with some curb extensions and crossing islands. So we start to look at the whole street. So as pedestrian and bicycle practitioners, it's really come to a point where we really need to think about all modes at all times. And the practice, I think, has really become street design, and in many ways. And so, and I know that's the way my practice has evolved, and I see that happening more and more all the time. So the need to get to new manuals. Well, we have seen others, like I said, realize this at the same time, and a growing number of cities start to replace their old, very auto-centric manuals with something like what San Francisco is doing or something like Charlotte's doing. And so part of my inspiration for this project was that first of all, I had a review role on the CNU ITE manual, and I kind of really liked what they were doing. I heard about New York's manual. I heard about Charlotte and Louisville's manual. The UK has just recently replaced their old manual for streets with something very, very new and people-oriented. And then San Francisco manual, which we looked at, and I thought was really sort of the closest to what we wanted to do. I thought they did a great job. All these cities have done great jobs in their manuals, and actually I didn't know, Phil, that you were all involved in that. So, your work was part of the inspiration for what we did. But in Los Angeles, I was thinking, okay, we need to change the street manual and get in there and do it. And so for several years, have been wanting to do a street manual, not only for LA, but for cities across the country, and thinking about looking for grant funding and so forth. And as it turned out, a little less than a year ago, one of my projects is I work a lot with county departments of public health. And one of my projects is we're technical assistance coordinators for grantees that are doing things like complete streets projects. And each of these city grantees have different projects they're doing, and I suggested to the grant manager it would be really useful if we could do something rather than reinvent the wheel for every city that they could all use. And we batted around a few ideas, and I told her about this idea for the street manual. She said, give me a budget. And fortunately, the public health folks have been really wonderful. She gave me a budget to produce this street manual, this model street manual for not only the grantee cities in LA County, but for any city in LA County, and for that matter, any city in the country. And we were able to fund that way all of the elements having to do with obesity and active transportation. There was one piece that was really important, and by the way, this comes in the context of, in California, we also have the Complete Streets Act, which says cities all are required to have a complete streets approach when they redo their circulation elements to their general plans. The other thing that we've got now is a requirement that cities have to start reducing the amount of stormwater runoff that goes into the waterways and into the ocean. And that's brand new this year as well, and cities don't know how to do that. That was a piece I couldn't fund with the obesity grant, but I was talking to I teach over at the UCLA Urban Planning School, and I was talking to somebody at the Luskin Center there, and she said, well, gee, maybe we could fund that street water piece of it, and they did. So we ended up with funding to produce a manual, and really, again, looking at some of the things that current manuals give us, and really in reaction to this, a street that you really wouldn't want to be on, a street that's not particularly hospitable to walk on or to cross, or very inviting, or something like this, where you've got land uses on both sides. What if you want to, you're one store on one side and you want to get to the store on the other side of the street? You might have to walk a half mile down the street to cross, and then not have a very inviting walk across there, and then have to walk a half mile back on a really narrow sidewalk that has no buffer on it, or something like this. We're calling our street, our manual, the Model Design Manual for Living Streets. This is what I would say is a dead street. There's just no life on this street, and so it's in reaction to this, and looking at all the other things that the current manuals have given us, partially to blame. We can't blame all these things on them, but the climate change and the air pollution, the traffic deaths, obesity, and all these other things, neighborhoods without identity. These are the consequences of using the old manuals and applying the old standards too much, and thinking what manuals could give us. Well, not always. Las Ramblas and Barcelona, they've got architecture as well there too, and that's the other piece of it. I think of our streets and our street manuals and standards as being half of the DNA of urban form. The other half is land use planning. And with this manual, we're dealing with the street side of it. We also need to deal with the land use planning side of it, and that's the new urbanism. But the street part is a very important part of it. We can't have streets that are active with people, that are inviting, that people want to walk down, that are what I call, we think of the four levels of pedestrian friendliness. Pedestrian unfriendly, which is lousy sidewalks, lousy crossings, basic accommodation, which is maybe got a basic sidewalk and basic street crossings and a few things there, but nothing really inviting. And then you've got pedestrian friendly, where you've got a lot of the good elements that we want with crossings and nice sidewalks and some landforms and everything. And then we go to the highest level. This is State Street in Santa Barbara. I call this pedestrian seductive. This is a street that you want to be out walking, and you're not even thinking about exercise. You're not even thinking that you're transporting yourself. You're enjoying the experience of being there, and that's what we want in a street. This is a living street where people are out. Or something like this in Seattle with the permeable concrete and the bioswale there to capture the water. These are what manuals could give us, and that's what we aimed to do with this. In order to do this manual, and we did it in a really short time. Like I said, I got authorization to proceed about last November. We really, I started to assemble, we did a 2-day charrette in March. And I brought many of the top street designers from across the country. You may recognize some friends in there. There's Michael Moll and Dan Burden and quite a other, Peter Lagerway, and again, some of our other friends, Michael Ronkin, and others that came. But we had civil engineers, we had transportation engineers, landscape architects, public health people, planners, sociologists, and and some other folks that had been involved in street design. About 25 people from across the country, some of the top people in street design, and about 20 sort of our local talent that came together in this 2-day charrette, and we drafted the chapters in March. And then since March, I also spent the next 3 months going through them, making sure that the chapters were consistent with one another, that the language matched, that we had good pictures and graphics. We had to make a lot of graphics, captions and editing and all this. So by the end of July, the manual was drafted. We also involved a long list of national, state, and local organizations. Everyone from AARP to Congress for the New Urbanism to American Institute of Architects to, again, County Department of Public Health, State Department of Public Health, the Watershed Council, Federal Highway Administration, ITE, a lot of national organizations that we're now using to help distribute the manual. We wanted them to feel as though, we wanted them to take ownership over it and feel as though the manual is theirs. So that was a big part of what we did, and we needed their input. So anyhow, starting with the chapters now. The first chapter is an introduction. It says why we're doing it. But a really important part, and this was written by Rock Miller and Ian Lockwood. Rock is the incoming president of ITE for next year. But we wanted to sort out all of this confusion about when you use AASHTO Green Book, when you use the California Highway Design Manual, how does MUTCD fit in, and what can you do in the way of local manuals. And because I see a lot of confusion with cities. They're not sure what applies where, and so they apply what they believe is the most conservative standard everywhere. They're using design standards that were meant for state highways on local city streets and 12-foot lanes, and things from the state highway design manual that were never meant for local streets, but they think that protects them from liability the most, and so that's what they use. This chapter untangles all that spaghetti that cities are confused about. You don't have to follow state highway standards for your local streets. You have a lot of leeway to develop your own standards and to have just as much protection from liability if you do. And AASHTO is much more flexible than many people understand. So we kind of sort that out, and hopefully that relieves cities and gives them the freedom to do things that they might have wanted to do, and to use this manual as a standard or to modify it and use others. The next chapter talks about the vision. So what is the vision? And I think of, and we're calling this living streets again. I think of living streets as complete streets plus. Complete streets is that we're planning for all modes, and that we're planning for people of all ages and physical abilities. Living streets encompasses that, but we also are interested in things like equity. We're interested in integrating the connectivity of pedestrian-oriented uses and land use design. We're interested in connecting people, creating places for people to meet. We want to involve people in the design of their streets. We want inviting streets. We want beautiful streets. We want healthy commerce along the streets. We want our streets to strengthen and enhance our neighborhoods, to become part of the identity of that neighborhood, and to help, placemaking. We want to encourage active and healthy lifestyles, and we want to integrate environmental stewardship. And we also understand that streets vary by neighborhood density, function, and many other ways. The character of the streets vary. So these are kind of the basic principles, and embodied in all this is safety and so forth. So these are the principles that we wanted to use in designing our streets, and hopefully we come out with something like this at the other end, again, Barcelona, or a State Street in Madison. I mean, these are living streets that have very different types. The next chapter deals with street networks and a classification system. Here we borrowed heavily from the CNU document, and in fact, many of the people that were involved in this writing of this chapter, Norm Garrick and some others were also involved in the Ellen Greenberg were involved in the CNU manual. But just making sure that we've got a network that looks more like the older network instead of the sort of cul-de-sac disconnected network, and establishing a street classification system that builds a lot on the CNU classification system. Was instead of arterials, we use boulevards and avenues and main streets and things like that, so that our streets are meant as connectors of neighborhoods rather than sort of conduits for moving cars and other vehicles. So we thought that street typology system was real important. We defined the streets and the different types of streets. Of course, this is 16th Street Transit Mall in Denver, which is, I think, one of my favorite streets. But as you can, this is not the street that would be for every street. You're going to have a version of a local residential street. You're going to have a main street. You're going to have, again, a boulevard. So there are different types of streets, and we have the street typologies defined in there. So we might have, like I said, something like an avenue or a boulevard that have very different looks to it, but also maybe something like shared space that you find in Copenhagen and all across Europe today. They're using, they're taking away space and creating from cars and creating these shared space streets. So we do have some in that. Now, the fourth chapter, the Traveled Way Design chapter, is what many designers and engineers look for in their street manuals. And we give them a lot of that information, but it's not as prescriptive. And when you're asking the question of, how specific or general do we get? We have in here principles of good street design. Rather than try to say how exactly every street should be designed, we have principles about the street lanes and the street widths or the lane widths and things like that. And every street really needs to be designed separately. We have a lot of cross-section examples of things that could be done. How do you take a wide 4-lane street and repurpose it? And either through road diet or adding islands or whatever. But there's examples of how you can redo streets, but we really have principles rather than prescriptions. And as I'm going around, we are starting to customize the manual for some cities now. The first reaction we're getting from some of the transportation engineers is, where are the standards? Where are the specifics? And you say, well, okay, for each city we can start to get more specific and provide more of that if that's what you really need. That's part of the customization process. But I think as a starting point, more important to have good principles. And if you apply these principles to street design, you should be able to design just about any street and have a good outcome. In this chapter, we also look at issues of, access management, not having too many driveways and not having wide driveways and so forth. So, like I said, there are lots of cross-section examples, but not meant to be prescriptions. How do you take a 6-lane street and redo it, or a 4-lane street and redo it? A chapter on intersection design, where we look at everything from the angle of the intersection as it comes into curb extensions for pedestrians, and how do you treat bicycles at intersections, and roundabouts, the potential for roundabouts and circles and mini roundabouts and mini circles to replace controlled stops, and how signals can play in and what sort of signalization techniques can be used. A chapter on universal access, which has a lot of the most important elements of universal access, with curb ramps and sidewalks and placement of things. And as well as we also have in this chapter the sidewalk design section. And by the way, this chapter is a really good example. I get a lot of questions about, well, does this guide replace that guide or another guide or something? No, it doesn't. When we started off producing this manual, and we started in our charrette, I said, I want the chapters to be about 15 pages each. We had 15 chapters. So I'm thinking of a 200 to 250 page manual. Ended up being just under 400 pages. But we couldn't cover everything. The idea is, let's get the basic information in here. And if you want all of the information on ADA design, you go to the US Access Board ADA design. If you want all of the information on sort of the newer bikeway designs, you go to the NACTO Bike Guide. So we refer to these other guides, but we try to cover the most important basics. But in this one, actually, just some things like signal placement, the things that a lot of cities don't get right. If they even don't go to the 300-page manual and they look at our chapter, they'll get a whole lot more information from what they typically do. I can't tell you how often I go out there and find just the push-button poles put in the wrong place. And things like the double perpendicular ramps instead of the single ramps and all that. But we go to actually quite a bit more detail in the street cross-section, or the sidewalk cross-section, with the 4 zones of the sidewalk. And the 4 zones of the sidewalk in different contexts on different types of streets, along different land uses, and sort of the minimums that each of these 4 zones should be. So there's a lot more sidewalk design guidance here than I've seen in any manual. We have a chapter on pedestrian crossings, and looking at all of the things that we can do from visible crosswalks to crossing islands and raised crosswalks and all of the sort of devices that we teach about in the FHWA pedestrian design safety course. And just how you can do your pedestrian crossings well, and how you can sort of again take a street and sort of retrofit it to make it work better for pedestrians. Thinking about things like the visibility of pedestrians at intersections. A chapter on bikeway design. Again, if you want the full thing, you go to the NACTO Bike Guide, but most cities aren't going to do that. This provides a lot of the most important information that you need in bikeway design. Everything from your basic bike lanes and preferring the wider lanes to the narrower lanes, but to bike boulevards, how do you get them through road diets, looking at bike boulevards, looking at cycle tracks, buffered bike lanes with simple paint. What do you do with intersections? How about contraflow lanes? So we do have a lot of the sort of more cutting edge things in here on bikeway design. Signals, for example, and making sure we've got our wayfinding signing in, as well as good parking. So we do talk about parking. A chapter on transit accommodation, and this is also a really important piece because we do have to make sure that all of these modes are integrating. So what do you do with bus bulbs at intersections, and having things like this is in Bogota, the Transmilenio busway, and looking at bus lanes and other treatments for buses in our city streets. Then a section on a whole chapter on traffic calming and the different measures that you use and kind of context that you'll use them in. Here's our chapter on streetscape ecosystem. And this is one by the San Francisco manual, I think is the only other one that I've seen that touches upon this a lot. So we brought in with landscape architects and civil engineers and others work on this, kind of looking at the different treatments of how do you let the water percolate down, but also things like street trees and bringing life to the streets and sort of this streetscape part of it. Replacing streets, thinking of our streets as public space, and how do you bring people out and make public space out of our streets. You might remember this looks like the Pavement to Parks project here. And just kind of creating places for people to be and places for people to interact. Designing land use along living streets, the interaction between the land use and the street, the sidewalk itself. How do these things interact with one another, and how should they interact? A chapter on retrofitting suburbia. So what do you do in a place where it's not designed the way we want it to be, but how can you reconnect? How can you retrofit the streets? How can you take neighborhoods? Maybe you've got a large shopping center where second generation growth, you take the shopping center down and you create a neighborhood out of it with connected streets and good pedestrian links and so forth. And then last chapter is about community engagement. This is an iterative process. We believe that the public should be involved, and not the old way where the consultant comes in and says, okay, here's what we did for your street, tell us what you think of it. but from the very get-go, we involve them in the street design. We bring them in, we have them, presentations where they understand the different things they can do, but how do you engage the public and how do you keep them involved, and all the way down to kids. We want this manual to become something that cities across the country use, and in fact we've had quite a bit of international interest in the manual as well. It can be downloaded at modelstreetdesignmanual.com. Just curious, how many have already seen it? Okay. We want this to be a template. We have this, the first thing you'll probably do is want the PDF version. I mean, here's the printed version. But we have this in a Word version, and we also have it in an InDesign version for those of you that like to have it look prettier and you've got InDesign capabilities. But any city can take this manual and customize it if you want, and put your name on the front of it and adopt it, add chapters to it, throw out the chapter that you don't like, change the numbers, but it's a starting point. It's a template for any city to use. And a lot of cities are starting to understand the value of their street manuals. So this, we hope, is an opportunity for a lot of cities to skip that part. If they don't have the internal expertise or the budget to start from scratch and do it all over, you're 90% there if you just start with this. Last, we're doing training. We're developing a day-long training workshop. We're doing 2-day actually it should have been 2-hour workshops. It says 2-day there. Late on the plane last night. And then we're also meeting with cities individually to give training. So that concludes my presentation. Right here?
Yes, I have a question. You mentioned that there are different books by which the local engineers can go. So what happens when you have a local street intersecting a state highway? Does the engineer then go to the Living Streets Manual and look at the California Highway Design Manual?
They might have to do that, but we're hoping that they can apply the principles that are in this manual on both. And in some cases, the states are providing, at least in California, they're starting to give cities more leeway to do things more creatively. They've got context-sensitive guidelines now, and they're being less strict about it. Actually, it depends on which district of Caltrans you're in. But we're hoping that we're actually, I'm giving a presentation to Secretary LaHood's office in a couple weeks, and they've been asking what they can do, and one of the things we're going to tell them is, get this presentation and the trainings to the state highways. And we're hoping that the state highways will read this and adopt some of the principles in this too, so that eventually the two will come together. But the short answer is they may have to look at both when they do that, but we're hoping not too much. Yes?
What's the cost of the model street design manual?
It's really expensive. You have to go to your computer and download it. Yeah. The only thing we're asking is if you adopt this manual, just keep the acknowledgments in there for 2 reasons: to acknowledge the people that worked on it, but more importantly, the credibility of the people that worked on it gives your manual legal cover. So, you can say, look, President of ITE worked on this manual, and other folks. So, it gives you more credibility to your manual. And the other thing we're asking for is you just notify us. We're kind of trying to keep track of how many cities adopt it, but that's all we ask. Just download it. It's free. Wanted to make it available. Yes?
I heard someone from the Chicago Department of Transportation speak a while ago about that when they were integrating the environmentally sensitive designs along with the complete streets designs, that they actually over the last, I don't know if it was 5 or 10 years, but they've been studying the cost and found that it was 30% cheaper than what they were doing. Do you have any data on that?
I don't, but I've heard similar numbers. And I think these things have to be looked at in really long terms and really sort of organically, in a way that it is more, there's more maintenance involved with sustainable street water management. But when you think of all the costs of the pollution, the health costs of the pollution, and you know, if you include all the I think it probably is cheaper to do things the right way, but it's not an easy equation to come up with. But I just, in the meantime, just do the right thing. I mean, that's what I'm hoping cities do, is design their streets right.
This,
It's up to you. You're the moderator.
well, I want to keep right.
Okay.
I think your point about what happens when the little street meets the big street it's very, very, very key. And which says something about what we're doing. You know, if we're getting every jurisdiction to adopt complete local street stuff, good. But we're not addressing the big boys, then we're only doing half the stuff.
Right.
Sometimes the DOT streets, you're running right through the middle of those towns.
Well, but that's a different case because there's a lot of, you know, when a highway, you know, when your main street, when a highway runs through it, I think that has been sort of on the agenda for a number of years. And that's sort of, people are starting to sort that out because that becomes then where you're talking to, and that's a big project at the state level. And there's a lot of pushback from a town point of view. But these little things are, you know, there's still a need to have a highway, but it still does cross local streets, and those don't they don't sort of bubble up to the top because they're just sort of these little ones.
Yeah. And the way we're looking at it is that within a community, there shouldn't be any of these sort of no-person streets. I mean, every street, whether it's an arterial, which we're calling boulevard, or a main street, should be something that is complete and living.